Hello, and welcome. Find a comfortable position now, letting your body settle, letting your muscles soften. There is nothing for you to do, and nowhere for you to be, except right here in this quiet space. Take a slow, deep breath in, and as you exhale, feel the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Let go of any lingering thoughts, any worries or plans. They can wait for the morning. Tonight is for rest. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time, not to a world of grand battles or dramatic events, but to a quieter, slower world. We are going to watch something grow, something immense and beautiful over a very, very long time. We are going to tell the story of a cathedral, a great church of stone and glass, rising from the earth over the course of many lifetimes. Our cathedral does not have a single famous name you might recognize from a history book. We will simply call it the Cathedral of Saint Avon-sur-Riviera, the Cathedral of Saint Avon on the river. So close your eyes if you feel comfortable, or simply let your gaze soften. Let my voice be your guide, and allow yourself to drift as we begin our story in a small, muddy town in the heart of France, a very long time ago, in the year of our Lord, 1175. Before the great cathedral, there was another church, a smaller, older building. It was a sturdy, Romanesque church with thick, heavy walls and small, rounded windows that let in only slivers of daylight. It was dark inside and cool. It smelled of old stone, damp earth, and centuries of incense. It had served the town of Saint Avon well, but the town was growing, and more than that, the world was changing. A new idea was taking root, an idea of light, of height, of reaching for the heavens themselves. The town's bishop, a man named Odo, was old, but his eyes were filled with a young man's ambition. He had traveled. He had seen the new churches rising in the north, near Paris. He spoke of buildings that seemed to defy the very weight of stone, with walls that were not walls at all, but shimmering tapestries of colored glass. He spoke of pointed arches that drew the eye upward, and ceilings so high they seemed to be a part of the sky. He dreamed of such a building for Saint Avon, a building that would take 100 years to complete, perhaps 200. He knew he would never see it finished. His children's children might not see it finished, but that did not matter. The thought was a comfort, not a concern. To begin something so grand was a gift to the future. It was an act of faith, written in stone. And so the decision was made. The old church, with its familiar shadows and deep, quiet coolness, would be carefully taken down. Its stones would be saved to be used in the foundations of the new, grander structure. It was a gentle transition, a promise that the past would not be forgotten, but would become the very ground upon which the future would stand. The first task was to prepare the ground. The site chosen was a gentle rise of land next to the slow, meandering River Avon. It was a meadow, dotted with wildflowers in the spring and buzzing with bees in the summer. For a year, the air was filled not with the ringing of hammers on stone, but with the rhythmic sounds of clearing the land. The thud of axes echoed from the nearby woods as ancient oaks were felled. Not for the cathedral itself, not yet, but for the temporary buildings that would rise around the site. A carpenter's workshop, a blacksmith's forge, a shelter for the workers, and a long, low building called a tracing house. Men with shovels and wheelbarrows, their movements slow and steady, leveled the earth. The work was paced by the sun. They began at dawn, when the mist still lay heavy on the river, and they finished as the sky turned to shades of orange and purple. Their tools were simple: wood, iron, and their own strength. There was no sound of engines, only the scrape of metal on dirt, the creak of a wooden wheel, the soft calls of men to one another. Imagine the smell of the air, the clean, sharp scent of freshly cut wood, the rich, dark smell of turned earth, and the faint, sweet scent of the river flowing nearby. It was the smell of a beginning. At the center of this cleared ground, a great pit was dug. This would be the foundation. It was a slow, careful process. The deeper they dug, the further back in time they went, uncovering layers of soil, clay, and river stone. Finally, they reached the bedrock, the solid, unyielding stone shelf upon which the entire dream would be built. Bishop Odo, now frailer but with a fire still in his eyes, led a procession from the temporary chapel. He blessed the ground. And then the first stone of the foundation was laid. It was not a grand, carved stone. It was a simple, massive block of granite lowered into its new home with a complex system of ropes and wooden levers. As it settled into its new home, a deep and satisfying thud echoed across the meadow. It was a sound that seemed to say, "Here we are, and here we will stay." The work of building the foundation took years. A labyrinth of trenches was dug, following a pattern that only the master builder, the architect of the dream, could see in his mind. These trenches were filled with layer upon layer of rubble and stone, packed down tight. It was not glamorous work. It was hidden work. Most of it would never be seen again by human eyes once the floor was laid above it. But everyone knew this was the most important work of all. A cathedral that reached for the heavens needed roots that went deep into the earth. And all the while the river flowed on, a constant, soothing presence. It watched as the seasons changed, as the workers' children grew from toddlers playing at the edge of the site to young boys carrying water and tools. The river had seen mountains rise and fall. It knew the secret of patience. While the foundations were being laid, another great work was happening miles away. The lifeblood of the cathedral, its very substance, was being drawn from the earth, the quarry. Imagine a place carved out of a hillside, a great open wound in the earth, but a beautiful one. The stone here was a pale, honey-colored limestone, perfect for building. It was soft enough to be carved when first quarried, but hardened over time when exposed to the air, becoming incredibly durable. The quarry had its own unique rhythm, its own gentle music. There was the sharp tink, tink, tink of the quarrier's picks, finding the natural seams in the rock. Then the deeper, more resonant sound of iron wedges being driven into those seams with heavy mallets. Thump, thump, thump. It was a slow, patient conversation with the stone. The workers were not fighting the rock, they were persuading it. They would drive a line of wedges, and then they would wait. They would pour water into the cracks, and in the winter, the water would freeze, expand, and gently push the rock apart. Sometimes a great groan would echo through the quarry as a massive slab, weighing many tons, finally surrendered and broke free from the hillside from which it had been born. These rough blocks were then shaped just enough to be loaded onto heavy wooden carts. The carts were pulled by teams of oxen, their broad, placid faces showing no hurry. The journey from the quarry to the cathedral site was slow, a few miles a day. The wooden wheels of the carts, often as tall as a man, groaned and creaked under the immense weight. The sound was a familiar one in the countryside, a slow, perambulating heartbeat of the great work. The oxen plodded along the muddy track, their breath misting in the cool morning air. The drivers walked beside them, calling out soft words of encouragement. This procession of stone was a constant, steady flow. It was a promise, arriving daily, that the dream was still alive, that the cathedral was still growing. At the construction site, the blocks were unloaded and taken over by a different kind of craftsman, the stone cutter. These were the men who would give the raw stone its final, perfect shape. They worked in open-sided sheds, protected from the rain but not the air. Each stone cutter had his own space, his own set of tools laid out neatly beside him. Mallets of different weights and chisels of every shape and size. The master mason, a man named Jean, would provide them with wooden templates, a template for a simple wall block, a template for a curved piece of an arch, a template for the intricate section of a window frame. The stone cutter would lay the template on his block, trace its outline, and then begin to chip away everything that was not the finished piece. Listen, can you hear the sound of the workshop? It's not a loud clattering noise. It's a chorus of individual sounds, 1,000 small controlled taps. Chip, chip, chip. A soft, rhythmic sound like a persistent stony woodpecker. And the air is filled with a fine white dust that coats everything, turning the workers' hair and beards pale gray and settling on the ground like a gentle fall of snow. They breathed in the dust of the very cathedral they were building. It became a part of them, just as their work became a part of it.
They were not rushing. Each blow of the mallet was precise, deliberate. To strike too hard could fracture the stone, wasting weeks of work by the quarriers and the carters. It was a craft of patience. A stone cutter might spend 2 whole days on a single complex block, and when he was finished, it would fit so perfectly against its neighbors that you could not slide a knife blade between them. And as they worked, they talked. They shared stories, sang old folk songs in a low hum. They were a community. They came from all over, drawn by the promise of steady work on a project that would outlive them all. They were building a house for God, yes, but they were also building a life for themselves, right here in the shadow of its rising walls. Slowly, so slowly, the walls began to rise. For the first few years, the progress was almost invisible from a distance. The work was all happening within the footprint of the foundation, building up the base, creating the crypts and the lower passages. But then, one spring, the work cleared ground level, and for the first time, the townspeople could see the shape of their new cathedral beginning to emerge from the earth. The master mason, Jean, was the keeper of the vision. He was not a king or a bishop, but on the construction site, his authority was absolute. He did not work from rolled-up blueprints as we might imagine. His plans were held in 3 places: in his mind, on a few precious sheets of parchment, and most importantly, on the floor of the tracing house. The tracing house was a long, low building with a smooth floor made of plaster of Paris. Here, Jean and his assistants would draw out the plans for the cathedral at full scale. Imagine a vast white floor covered in a complex web of black lines, arcs, and geometric shapes. Here, the curve of a mighty arch was drawn out in its true size. Here, the intricate pattern of a window stone tracery was perfected. This floor was the cathedral's soul, its paper-thin ghost. From these lines, wooden templates were made for the stonecutters and carpenters. It was a quiet contemplation. Jean would spend hours there, often alone, a single candle burning late into the night. He would walk along the lines, imagining the stones rising, feeling the weight and balance of the structure in his mind. He was solving immense puzzles of geometry and physics with tools as simple as a compass, a straight edge, and a piece of charcoal.
Outside, the walls climbed higher. The process was a slow, layered dance. First, a course of perfectly cut stones for the outer face. Then, a course for the inner face. And the wide space between them was filled with a core of rubble, flint, and a special kind of mortar. The mortar was a recipe as important as the stone itself. It was made from lime, which was created by burning chalk or limestone in a kiln. The kilns were pits in the ground, and they had to be tended day and night for a week, the fire kept at a precise temperature. The smell of the burning lime was sharp and pungent, a familiar aroma around the growing cathedral. Once burned, the lime was mixed with sand and water to create a mortar that would take centuries to fully cure, becoming, in essence, a man-made stone, binding all the individual blocks into one single monolithic structure. To lift the stones and the heavy buckets of mortar, the builders used great wooden wheels powered by men walking inside them like hamsters in a cage. These treadwheel cranes were marvels of simple engineering. The men inside would walk and walk and walk, their steady, plodding steps turning the wheel, which wound a rope, which lifted a stone high into the air. From the ground, the stone would seem to rise with a magical slowness, swinging gently until it reached the top of the wall where waiting hands would guide it carefully into place. The men in the wheel could not see the stone they were lifting. They relied on a system of shouted commands and signals. It was a job built on trust and rhythm. And so the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. The walls rose, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. They grew at the pace of a slow tree. The townspeople grew accustomed to the sight. It was the backdrop to their lives. A child born on the day the first stone was laid would now be a young man, perhaps even finding his own work on the site, looking up at a wall his father had helped to build, a wall that was still only halfway to its final height. The cathedral was not just being built in the town, it was growing up with the town. It was becoming part of the family. As the walls climbed higher, a revolutionary new idea began to take shape. This was the genius of the Gothic style. The builders realized that the heavy, solid walls of the old Romanesque churches were no longer necessary. The weight of the roof could be directed downwards through specific points, through slender columns and ribs. The walls in between these points no longer needed to be thick and heavy. The walls could disappear.
And in their place would be light. This was achieved through two key innovations you could now see rising on the site of St. Denis. The first was the pointed arch. Unlike the old rounded Romanesque arch, which pushed weight outwards, the pointed arch directed the weight more vertically, downwards. It also gave a feeling of soaring height, drawing the eye and the spirit upwards. The second innovation was the ribbed vault. Instead of a heavy, solid stone barrel vault for the ceiling, the master mason designed a skeleton of arched stone ribs. These ribs would cross and connect, creating a framework. The spaces between the ribs could then be filled in with much thinner, lighter panels of stone. It was stronger, lighter, and infinitely more graceful. The interior of the cathedral began to take shape, but it was a strange and wonderful sight. It was a forest of wood. An immense, complex web of scaffolding filled the entire space. It was a temporary cathedral made of timber, rising alongside the permanent one made of stone. The carpenters were as essential as the masons. They built the scaffolding, the cranes, the templates, and, most importantly, the centering. Centering was the curved wooden framework upon which an arch or a vault was built. The masons would lay the precisely cut stones of the arch, the voussoirs, onto the wooden frame, building from both sides until they met at the top. The final, central stone was the keystone. Once the keystone was tapped into place, it locked the entire arch together, distributing the weight. For a time, the arch would still rest on its wooden centering as the mortar cured. The day they struck the centering was always a moment of quiet tension and awe. The carpenters would carefully remove the wooden framework, and for the first time, the stone arch would be supporting its own immense weight. There was always a collective held breath, followed by a quiet sigh of relief and admiration, as the arch stood firm, a perfect curve of stone suspended in the air.
With these new techniques, the interior of the cathedral became a forest of slender stone columns. They rose from the floor and branched out high above, like the trunks of great trees, their stone ribs spreading across the ceiling to form the vaulting. The builders were recreating the feeling of a sacred grove, a forest canopy, but in stone. And because the walls were no longer needed for support, they could be opened up. They could become vast, empty spaces waiting to be filled, not with more stone, but with color, with story, with light itself. The age of stained glass had arrived. In a workshop not far from the rising cathedral, a different kind of alchemy was taking place. This was the glazier's workshop, and it was a place of fire, sand, and secrets. Here, a master artisan, a woman named Isabel, was creating the windows for St. Yvonne. The process began with a simple recipe: sand and wood ash. These were heated in a clay crucible inside a fiercely hot furnace, tended day and night. The heat was so intense, the air in the workshop shimmered. The sand and ash would slowly melt together, transforming from gritty solids into a thick, glowing, honey-like liquid, molten glass. To create the colors, Isabel would add secret ingredients to the molten glass: powders of ground-up metals, a pinch of cobalt oxide for a deep sapphire blue, a touch of copper for a vibrant ruby red, iron for a pale watery green, and manganese for a royal purple. These were recipes passed down through generations, guarded jealously. When the color was right, a glob of molten glass would be gathered on the end of a long blowpipe. A glassblower, his cheeks puffed, would blow gently into the pipe, creating a bubble of glowing liquid color. This bubble was then swung, shaped, and finally flattened into a sheet. The sheets were not perfectly smooth or clear like modern glass. They were filled with tiny bubbles, streaks, and imperfections. But these imperfections were the source of their beauty. They would catch the light, scatter it, and make it dance. The great windows of the cathedral were not made from single panes of glass. They were mosaics, made from thousands of small pieces, each one telling a part of a larger story. Isabel and her father before her would first draw the design for a window on a large whitewashed wooden board, a scene from the Bible, the life of a saint, the crest of a noble family who had donated to the building.
This drawing was like a map. Each shape was numbered. Then the colored sheets of glass were laid over the drawing, and with a hot iron tool, the glazier would carefully crack the glass along the lines, shaping each individual piece. It was like putting together a giant luminous puzzle. Once all the pieces were cut, they had to be joined together. This was done with strips of soft, flexible lead, which had an H-shaped channel. Each piece of glass was fitted snugly into the channel of the lead cames, as they were called. The joints were then soldered together, making the whole panel strong. Finally, a dark cement-like paste was rubbed into the gaps to make the window waterproof and to enhance the black outlines of the design. Imagine a finished panel lying on the workshop table. In the dim light, it looks dark and confusing, a web of black lines. But then, an apprentice lifts it and holds it up to the light of a window. And suddenly, it comes alive. Light streams through the colored glass, setting it ablaze. The blues become deeper than the sky, the reds richer than blood. The figures in the window seem to glow with an inner fire. The light is no longer just light. It has been transformed. It is now telling a story, painting the air itself with color. These finished panels were carefully transported to the cathedral and fitted into the great stone openings that had been prepared for them. From the outside, the windows looked dark, but from the inside, as the sun moved across the sky, the cathedral's interior was painted with shifting pools of sapphire, ruby, and emerald light. The stone floors and columns would be awash with color. It was a miracle. The heavy, earth-bound stone of the cathedral was being filled with the light of heaven. For the common person of Saint-Yvon, who could not read, these windows were their Bible, their storybook, their art gallery. They could stand in the colored light and have the stories of their faith wash over them, a silent, beautiful sermon.
The cathedral was growing taller than any building anyone had ever seen. And as it grew, a new problem arose. The immense weight of the stone-vaulted roof, channeled through the slender columns, was still pushing the thin walls outwards. The pointed arches helped, but it was not enough. The walls, now filled with so much glass, were fragile. The solution was another stroke of Gothic genius, and it would come to define the look of the cathedral from the outside: the flying buttress. Imagine great, soaring arches of stone leaping from the outer walls of the cathedral over the side aisles and down to massive, solid piers built on the ground some distance away. They look like the fossilized skeletons of giant creatures, or like gentle stone arms reaching out to brace and hold the cathedral's high walls. That is exactly what they were. They were an external skeleton. They caught the outward thrust of the roof and the high walls and channeled it safely down into the ground. It was an elegant, beautiful solution to an enormous engineering problem. And it was a daring one. It meant that the building was, in a way, turned inside out. Its supporting structures were now on the outside for all to see. This freed the interior to be even more light, more open, more graceful. The walls could climb higher still. The windows could become even larger. The flying buttresses allowed the dream of a stone building that was almost weightless to become a reality. To be a worker on the scaffolding now was a breathtaking and terrifying experience. They were working hundreds of feet in the air, with nothing but wooden planks between them and the ground far below. They had a view that had previously been reserved only for the birds. They could see the whole town of Saint-Yvon laid out below them, its winding streets, its timber-framed houses with their thatched roofs. They could see the river Avon, a silver ribbon snaking through the green fields. They walked these high scaffolds with a slow, careful confidence. They were accustomed to the heights, to the feel of the wind. You could hear them calling to one another, their voices carrying strangely in the thin air. You could hear the tap-tap-tapping of their hammers as they secured a timber, or the scrape of a trowel as a mason set a stone on the very edge of the world.
And up here, another kind of artist was at work, the stone carver. While the stone cutters created the building's perfect geometric blocks, the carvers created its soul. They were given more freedom on the high ledges, at the tops of columns, and especially on the gargoyles. They let their imaginations run wild. The gargoyles were not just decoration. They were functional, designed as waterspouts to throw rainwater far from the cathedral's walls, protecting the stone and the foundations from erosion. But the carvers turned these functional spouts
into a menagerie of fantastic creatures. They carved snarling demons, mischievous imps, men with the bodies of lions, and creatures that seemed to be a mix of bird, reptile, and human. Some were terrifying, some were comical. It was as if the disciplined, geometric world of the cathedral had sprouted a wild, chaotic fringe at its edges. They also carved the saints that would stand in the niches of the doorways, and the scenes from the Bible that would decorate the portals. Here the work was more sober, more refined, but each carver left a little of himself in the stone. The way a fold of drapery fell, the gentle expression on a saint's face, the curl of a beard. If you look closely at these old carvings, you can sometimes feel the presence of the man who carved them 700 years ago. You can almost feel the gentle pressure of his hands on the now weathered stone. These men worked in the wind and the sun, slowly bringing the cold stone to life. And their work would, for the most part, be seen only from a great distance, tiny details on a colossal structure. But they did it anyway. They did it with care, with skill, with a quiet pride. They were adding their own verse to the great stone poem of the cathedral.
For more than a century, the work at St. Yvon had continued. It was not a constant, frantic pace, but a steady, seasonal rhythm. Work would slow in the deep winter when the mortar would freeze and the days were short. It would pick up again in the spring with a new energy. Generations had passed. The first master mason, John, was long gone. His secrets and plans passed on to his son, and then to his grandson. Boys who had carried water for the first masons were now old men, grandfathers themselves, telling stories of the early days to children who could not imagine the town without the great unfinished cathedral at its heart. The main body of the cathedral was complete. The nave, the choir, the transepts. The roof was on, covered in heavy lead tiles that shone like silver in the sun. The stained glass was mostly in place, filling the interior with its silent, colored music. From the inside, it felt whole. It was already being used for services. The sound of chanted prayers and choir song now echoed among the stone columns, where for so long there had only been the sound of hammers and chisels. But the cathedral was not finished. The two great towers at the front, which were meant to be crowned with soaring spires, stood as blunt, square stumps against the sky. The funds, which had once flowed so freely, were now harder to come by. A series of poor harvests, a distant war, these things took their toll. The pace of work slowed, and then it stopped.
And then, in the middle of the 14th century, a great silence fell over the cathedral and over all of Europe. A terrible pestilence, the Black Death, swept across the land. It emptied villages and towns. In St. Yvon, the once busy construction site became deserted. The stonecutters' sheds stood empty. The great treadwheel cranes stood motionless, the ropes stiffening in the rain. For decades, the cathedral waited. It stood, magnificent but incomplete, a giant with its head in the clouds and its arms yet to be raised. Weeds began to grow in the quiet courtyards. Ivy began its slow, patient climb up the stone of the buttress piers. Birds nested in the mouths of the gargoyles and in the unfinished tops of the towers. The sound of construction was replaced by a different set of sounds. The sighing of the wind whistling through the high arches, the cooing of pigeons, the distant, mournful tolling of the town's small remaining church bell, a sound that now seemed to mark not the hours of the day, but the passing of souls. The great cathedral became a silent witness to the town's grief and its slow recovery. It was a constant presence, a reminder of a more ambitious, more hopeful time, and yet it was also a promise. Its solid, enduring stone seemed to say that humanity, too, would endure, that this silence would not last forever. Children who survived the plague grew up playing in the shadow of the silent giant. They did not know the sound of its construction. To them, it had always been this way, vast, quiet, and unfinished. It was simply a part of their world, as natural as the river and the hills. A beautiful, sleeping dream of stone.
Almost 100 years passed. The world had changed. The town of Saint-Yvon had healed. New generations were born, with no memory of the great silence. And as prosperity slowly returned, their eyes once again turned to the great, unfinished cathedral. It was a strange and wonderful thing. A new master mason was hired, the great-great-grandson of a man who had carved saints for the portals. He unrolled the ancient brittle parchments, the plans of the first masters. He climbed through the dusty, forgotten passages of the cathedral, studying the work of his ancestors. He had to relearn their techniques, understand their vision. It was like picking up a conversation that had been paused for a century. A new call went out for stonemasons, for carpenters, for laborers. And they came. They came to finish the work their forefathers had begun. The deserted construction site was cleared once more. The weeds were pulled, the sheds repaired, the old tools were cleaned, and new ones were forged in the blacksmith's fire. And one day, a sound returned to the air of Saint-Yvon that had not been heard for a lifetime. The rhythmic, gentle chip, chip, chip of a chisel on stone. The slow, groaning creak of the great treadwheel crane being brought back to life. The silence was over. The dream had reawakened. The first great task was to complete the towers and finally to build the spires. This was the most dangerous work yet. The scaffolding had to be built higher and higher, becoming a slender spider-like web of timber clinging to the stone towers. The men who worked up there were a special breed, with no fear of heights. They were called skywalkers by the townspeople below, who would watch them, tiny figures moving against the clouds with a mixture of fear and admiration. The stone was lifted, piece by piece, to these dizzying heights. Each block was carved with incredible precision to fit the tapering octagonal shape of the spire. It was like building a hollow mountain peak, a cone of stone and air. Inside the spire, as it rose, there was nothing but a spiraling wooden staircase and the ever-present wind, which moaned and whistled through the carved openings in the stone. It was a lonely, ethereal workplace. The masons up here could feel the whole structure sway slightly in a strong gust, a terrifying and exhilarating feeling. They were working at the very boundary between the earth and the sky.
And finally, the day came when the last stone, the capstone,
was ready to be placed on the first spire. It was a single carved pyramid of stone, topped with a cross. It was blessed by the bishop in a ceremony on the ground, and then it began its long, slow journey upwards. The whole town watched, silent, their heads craned back. The stone rose smaller and smaller until it was just a speck. High above, the skywalkers, guided by their master, carefully lowered it into place. A cheer erupted from the crowd below, a sound of pure joy and relief that rolled across the fields and echoed from the hills. A spire, a finger of stone pointing to the heavens, now crowned their cathedral. It had taken almost 250 years, but the cathedral had finally reached its full height. It was a testament not just to faith or to ambition, but to the incredible, stubborn resilience of a community that had refused to let a dream die. The cathedral now had its shape, its towering silhouette against the sky, but it still lacked its voice. That work fell to the bell founder, a master of fire and metal. Casting a great bell was a monumental event, a mixture of heavy industry, precise science, and sacred ritual. First, a great pit was dug in the ground near the cathedral. Inside this pit, the mold for the bell was carefully constructed. It was a complex, two-part affair. The inner core, which would form the inside of the bell, was built up with brick and covered in a smooth layer of clay and horse manure, shaped perfectly to the desired profile. The outer casing, or cope, was then built over this, leaving a space between the two layers, the exact shape and thickness of the final bell. The cope was also covered in inscriptions and decorations, backwards of course, so they would read correctly on the finished product. The names of the saints, the year, the name of the donor. Once the mold was complete and had been slowly and carefully dried with fires, it was time for the casting. Great furnaces had been built next to the pit, and for days they were fed with wood and charcoal, heating the bronze, a mixture of copper and tin, until it glowed like the setting sun.
The Day of the Poor was a town-wide event. The priest blessed the furnaces, the mold, and the molten metal. The townspeople gathered in a safe distance, their faces lit by the orange glow. The air was thick with heat and anticipation. Then the master founder gave the signal. The clay plug on the furnace was broken, and a river of brilliant, white-hot liquid bronze flowed out, down a clay channel, and into the waiting mold. It was a dangerous, beautiful moment. The metal hissed and spat, filling the pit with a searing heat and a sharp, metallic smell. The founder and his assistants, their faces covered and protected, guided the flow with long iron rods, ensuring the mold filled evenly. And then it was done. The river of fire subsided. The mold was full. Now all they could do was wait. It would take days, sometimes over a week, for a great bell to cool completely. The ground around the pit remained warm for a long time. It was a time of quiet hope. Had the casting been successful? Were there any hidden cracks or flaws? Finally, the day came to raise the bell. The earth was dug away, the outer mold was carefully broken apart, revealing the bell within. It was not yet beautiful. It was a rough, dark, oxidized bronze. But it was a bell. It was winched from its pit, a giant sleeping metal heart.
Then came the cleaning and tuning. The bell was scrubbed and polished until it shone. The tuner, a master craftsman with an incredibly sensitive ear, would then carefully chip away small amounts of metal from the inside of the bell's rim to perfect its sound, to find its true note and the complex web of overtones that gave it its unique voice. The great bell of Saint-Yvon, christened Marie, was ready. It was hoisted, slowly and carefully, up into the belfry of the newly completed tower. It was a journey that took many days, using ropes, pulleys, and the strength of 100 men. Finally, it was hung in its massive oak frame. The first time it was rung, the whole town fell silent. The bell ringers pulled the heavy ropes, and the great bell swung, slowly at first, and then it struck. A deep, resonant bronze boom rolled out from the tower. It was a sound that you felt as much as you heard, a vibration that seemed to settle deep in your bones. It was a sound of completion, of celebration, of a promise fulfilled. The voice of the cathedral, silent for so long, was now singing out across the valley, a voice that would mark the hours, the joys, and the sorrows of the town of Saint-Yvon for centuries to come. And so our cathedral is finished, or rather, the main construction is finished. For a cathedral is never truly finished. It is a living thing of stone and glass, and like all living things, it needs care. Let us step forward in time, past the age of its builders. The centuries begin to turn. The world outside the cathedral's walls changes in ways its first architects could never have imagined. New styles of clothing, new forms of government, new machines, new ideas. The town of Saint-Yvon grows around it. The small timber-framed houses are replaced by grander stone buildings. The muddy tracks become cobbled streets. But the cathedral remains. It becomes the quiet, constant heart of the town. Its presence is a comfort. Its shadow moves across the town square each day like a slow, majestic sundial. Its bell marks the rhythm of life, the call to prayer, the celebration of a wedding, the sad tolling for a funeral. It is a silent witness to generations of human life, to countless small forgotten moments of joy, grief, love, and hope that unfold beneath its gaze. Imagine the life of the cathedral now, the quiet of a Tuesday morning. A woman comes in from the bustling market, seeking a moment of peace. She steps through the great wooden doors, and the sounds of the town fall away, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The air inside is cool and smells faintly of stone dust, old wood, and beeswax from the candles. Light, filtered through the high stained glass windows, dapples the stone floor in pools of color. The cathedral is so vast that her footsteps make no echo. She is a tiny figure in an immense holy space,
but it does not feel intimidating. It feels welcoming. It feels like a place that has been waiting for her. A verger, an old man whose job it is to care for the cathedral, moves slowly down the aisle, his soft-soled shoes making no sound. He carries a long pole with a taper at the end, and he lights the tall candles on the altar, one by one. Each new flame is a small star in the cool darkness. High above, in the complex maze of the roof timbers, a space the masons called the forest because of its huge oak beams, a carpenter checks for leaks after a storm. He walks along ancient wooden pathways, the same paths his ancestors walked. He can see the back of the great stone vaults, the raw, unfinished side of the cathedral's beautiful ceiling. It is a secret, hidden world, smelling of dry, ancient wood. The cathedral weathers the seasons. In summer, its cool stone is a refuge from the heat. In winter, snow dusts its spires and settles on the sills of its high windows, and the inside feels like a safe, quiet haven from the cold. In autumn, the low sun hits the western windows at just the right angle, and for a few minutes each afternoon, the entire nave is set ablaze with a fiery golden light. The stone on the outside weathers. The crisp edges of the carvings are softened by centuries of wind and rain. The pale, honey-colored limestone darkens to a venerable gray, stained with green and black patches of lichen. The cathedral is gaining the patina of age. It is settling into the landscape, becoming a part of the geology of the place. A man-made mountain.
It is no longer a construction site. It is a sanctuary. It is a library of stories, held in its glass and stone. It is a testament to the patience of human hands and the slow, deep passage of time. It has stood for so long that it seems it will stand forever. It has become timeless. And now our story comes to a close. The Cathedral of Saint-Avon-sur-Rivière stands complete, peaceful, enduring. The sounds of its making, the tap of the chisel, the groan of the crane, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer have all faded away, leaving behind only a great and gentle silence. The hopes and dreams of Bishop Odo, the careful calculations of the master mason Jean, the skilled hands of the carvers and the glaziers, they all live on, held in the quiet embrace of the stone and glass. The cathedral breathes with the passing of the day. The light inside shifts and changes, from the cool gray light of dawn to the warm golden light of afternoon, to the deep blue shadows of twilight. It has watched centuries drift by like clouds across the sky. And now it simply is. A place of peace, a place of rest. And just as the cathedral found its final peaceful form, so too can you find your rest now.
Let the story fade, like the last light from a stained glass window at dusk. Let your thoughts soften, like the weathered edges of ancient stone. Feel the steady, patient rhythm of your own breathing, in and out, a slow, comforting rhythm that has been with you all day and will watch over you all night. You have built nothing today, and there is nothing you need to build tomorrow. Your only task now is to rest, to let go. Imagine the deep, quiet stillness within the cathedral walls. Let that same stillness, that same peace, settle over you. A deep, heavy, comfortable peace. Letting go of the day, letting go of the story, letting yourself drift now on a slow, gentle river into a deep and peaceful sleep. Sleep now. Sleep.